Book 1, Chapter 2, Part 1 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Allan Armadale. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 2, The Man Revealed. The first cool breathings of the coming dawn fluttered through the open window as Mr. Brock read the closing lines of the confession. He put it away from him in silence, without looking up. The first shock of discovery had struck his mind, and had passed away again. At his age, and with his habits of thought, his grasp was not strong enough to hold the whole revelation that had fallen on him. All his heart, when he closed the manuscript, was with the memory of the woman who had been the beloved friend of his later and happier life. All his thoughts were busy with the miserable secret of her treason to her own father which the letter had disclosed. He was startled out of the narrow limits of his own little grief by the vibration of the table at which he sat, under a hand that was laid upon it heavily. The instinct of reluctance was strong in him, but he conquered it and looked up. There, silently confronting him in the mixed light of the yellow candle flame and the faint gray dawn, stood the castaway of the village inn, the inheritor of the fatal Armadale name. Mr. Brock shuddered as the terror of the present time, and the darker terror yet of the future that might be coming, rushed back on him at the sight of the man's face. The man saw it, and spoke first. "Is my father's crime looking at you out of my eyes?" he asked. "Has the ghost of the drowned man followed me into the room?" The suffering and the passion that he was forcing back shook the hand that he still kept on the table, and stifled the voice in which he spoke until it sank to a whisper. "I have no wish to treat you otherwise than justly and kindly," answered Mr. Brock. "Do me justice on my side, and believe that I am incapable of cruelly holding you responsible for your father's crime." The reply seemed to compose him. He bowed his head in silence, and took up the confession from the table. "Have you read this through?" he asked quietly. "Every word of it, from first to last." "Have I dealt openly with you so far? Has Ozias Midwinter—" "Do you still call yourself by that name?" interrupted Mr. Brock. "Now that your true name is known to me?" "Since I have read my father's confession," was the answer, "I like my ugly alias better than ever. Allow me to repeat the question which I was about to put to you a minute since. Has Ozias Midwinter done his best thus far to enlighten Mr. Brock?" The rector evaded a direct reply. "Few men in your position," he said, "would have had the courage to show me that letter." "Don't be too sure, sir, of the vagabond you picked up at the inn till you know a little more of him than you know now. You have got the secret of my birth, but you are not in possession yet with the story of my life. You ought to know it, and you shall know it before you leave me alone with Mr. Armadale. Will you wait and rest a little while, or shall I tell it you now?" "Now," said Mr. Brock, still as far away as ever from knowing the real character of the man before him. Everything Ozias Midwinter said, everything Ozias Midwinter did, was against him. He had spoken with a sardonic indifference, almost with an insolence of tone, which would have repelled the sympathies of any man who heard him. And now, instead of placing himself at the table and addressing his story directly to the rector, he withdrew silently and ungraciously to the window-seat. There he sat, his face averted, his hands mechanically turning the leaves of his father's letter till he came to the last. With his eyes fixed on the closing lines of the manuscript, and with a strange mixture of recklessness and sadness in his voice, he began his promised narrative in these words: "The first thing you know of me," he said, "is what my father's confession has told you already. He mentions here that I was a child, asleep on his breast, when he spoke his last words in this world, and when a stranger's hand wrote them down for him at his deathbed. That stranger's name, as you may have noticed, is signed on the cover. Alexander Neal, writer to the Signet, Edinburgh. The first recollection I have is of Alexander Neal beating me with a horsewhip (I dare say I deserved it) in the character of my stepfather. "Have you no recollection of your mother at the same time?" asked Mr. Brock. "Yes. I remember her having shabby old clothes made up to fit me, and having fine new frocks bought for her two children by her second husband. I remember the servants laughing at me in my old things, and the horsewhip finding its way to my shoulders again, for losing my temper and tearing my shabby clothes. My next recollection gets on to a year or two later. I remember myself locked up in a lumber room, with a bit of bread and a mug of water, wondering what it was that made my mother and my stepfather seem to hate the very sight of me. I never settled that question till yesterday, and then I solved the mystery, when my father's letter was put into my hands. My mother knew what had really happened on board the French timber ship, and my stepfather knew what had really happened, and they were both well aware that the shameful secret which they would fain have kept from every living creature was a secret which would be one day revealed to me. There was no help for it. The confession was in my executor's hands, and there was I, an ill-conditioned brat, with my mother's negro blood in my face, and my murdering father's passions in my heart, inheritor of their secret in spite of them. I don't wonder at the horsewhip now, or at the shabby clothes, or the bread and water in the lumber room. Natural penalties, all of them, sir, which the child was beginning to pay already for the father's sin." Mr. Brock looked at the swarthy, secret face, still obstinately turned away from him. "Is this the stark insensibility of a vagabond," he asked himself, "or the despair in disguise of a miserable man?" "School is my next recollection," the other went on. "A cheap place in a lost corner of Scotland. I was left there with a bad character to help me at starting. I spare you the story of the master's cane in the schoolroom, and the boys' kicks in the playground. I dare say there was ingrained ingratitude in my nature; at any rate, I ran away. The first person who met me asked my name. I was too young and too foolish to know the importance of concealing it, and, as a matter of course, I was taken back to school the same evening. The result taught me a lesson which I have not forgotten since. In a day or two more, like the vagabond I was, I ran away for the second time. The school watchdog had had his instructions, I suppose. He stopped me before I got outside the gate. Here is his mark among the rest, on the back of my hand. His master's marks I can't show you; they are all on my back. Can you believe in my perversity? There was a devil in me that no dog could worry out. I ran away again as soon as I left my bed, and this time I got off. At nightfall I found myself, with a pocket full of the school oatmeal, lost on a moor. I lay down on the fine soft heather, under the lee of a great gray rock. Do you think I felt lonely? Not I! I was away from my master's cane, away from my schoolfellow's kicks, away from my mother, away from my stepfather. And I lay down that night under my good friend the rock, the happiest boy in all Scotland. Through the wretched childhood which that one significant circumstance disclosed, Mr. Brock began to see dimly how little was really strange, how little really unaccountable, in the character of the man who was now speaking to him. "I slept soundly," Midwinter continued, "under my friend the rock. When I woke in the morning, I found a sturdy old man with a fiddle sitting on one side of me, and two performing dogs on the other. Experience had made me too sharp to tell the truth when the man put his first questions. He didn't press them. He gave me a good breakfast out of his knapsack, and he let me romp with the dogs. 'I'll tell you what,' he said, when he had got my confidence in this manner. 'You want three things, my man. You want a new father, a new family, and a new name. I'll be your father. I'll let you have the dogs for your brothers, and if you'll promise to be very careful of it, I'll give you my own good name into the bargain. Ozias Midwinter, Junior, you have had a good breakfast. If you want a good dinner, come along with me.' He got up, the dogs trotted after him, and I trotted after the dogs. Who was my new father, you will ask? A half-breed gypsy, sir. A drunkard, a ruffian, and a thief, and the best friend I ever had. Isn't a man your friend who gives you your food, your shelter, and your education? Ozias Midwinter taught me to dance the Highland fling, to throw somersaults, to walk on stilts, and to sing songs to his fiddle. Sometimes we roamed the country and performed at fairs. Sometimes we tried the large towns, and enlivened bad company over its cups. I was a nice, lively little boy of 11 years old, and bad company, the women especially, took a fancy to me and my nimble feet. I was vagabond enough to like the life. The dogs and I lived together, ate and drank and slept together. I can't think of those poor little 4-footed brothers of mine, even now, without a choking in the throat. Many is the beating we 3 took together. Many is the hard day's dancing we did together. Many is the night we have slept together and whimpered together on the cold hillside. I'm not trying to distress you, sir. I'm only telling you the truth. The life, with all its hardships, was a life that fitted me, and the half-breed gypsy who gave me his name, ruffian as he was a ruffian I liked." "A man who beat you!" exclaimed Mr. Brock in astonishment. "Didn't I tell you just now, sir, that I lived with the dogs? And did you ever hear of a dog who liked his master the worse for beating him? Hundreds of thousands of miserable men, women, and children would have liked that man as I liked him, if he had always given them what he always gave me, plenty to eat. It was stolen food mostly, and my new gypsy father was generous with it. He seldom laid the stick on us when he was sober, but it diverted him to hear us yelp when he was drunk. He died drunk, and enjoyed his favorite amusement with his last breath. One day, when I had been 2 years in his service, after giving us a good dinner out on the moor, he sat down with his back against a stone, and called us up to divert himself with his stick. He made the dogs yelp first, and then he called to me. I didn't go very willingly. He had been drinking harder than usual, and the more he drank, the better he liked his after-dinner amusement. He was in high good humor that day, and he hit me so hard that he toppled over, in his drunken state, with the force of his own blow. He fell with his face in a puddle, and lay there without moving. I and the dogs stood at a distance, and looked at him. We thought he was feigning, to get us nearer and have another stroke at us. He feigned so long that we ventured up to him at last. It took me some time to pull him over. He was a heavy man. When I did get him on his back, he was dead. We made all the outcry we could, but the dogs were little, and I was little, and the place was lonely, and no help came to us. I took his fiddle and his stick. I said to my 2 brothers, 'Come along, we must get our own living now,' and we went away heavy-hearted, and left him on the moor. Unnatural as it may seem to you, I was sorry for him. I kept his ugly name through all my after wanderings, and I have had enough of the old leaven left in me to like the sound of it still. Midwinter or Armadale, never mind my name now, we will talk of that afterward. You must know the worst of me first." "Why not the best of you?" asked Mr. Brock gently. "Thank you, sir, but I am here to tell the truth. We will get on, if you please, to the next chapter in my story. The dogs and I did badly, after our master's death. Our luck was against us. I lost one of my little brothers, the best performer of the 2. He was stolen, and I never recovered him. My fiddle and my stilts were taken from me next, by main force, by a tramp who was stronger than I. These misfortunes drew Tommy and me—I beg your pardon, sir, I mean the dog—closer together than ever. I think we had some kind of dim foreboding on both sides that we had not done with our misfortunes yet. Anyhow, it was not very long before we were parted forever. We were neither of us thieves. Our master had been satisfied with teaching us to dance. But we both committed an invasion of the rights of property for all that. Young creatures, even when they are half starved, cannot resist taking a run sometimes on a fine morning. Tommy and I could not resist taking a run into a gentleman's plantation. The gentleman preserved his game, and the gentleman's keeper knew his business. I heard a gun go off. You can guess the rest. God preserve me from ever feeling such misery again as I felt when I lay down by Tommy and took him, dead and bloody, into my arms. The keeper attempted to part us. I bit him, like the wild animal I was. He tried the stick on me next. He might as well have tried it on one of the trees. The noise reached the ears of two young ladies riding near the place, daughters of the gentleman on whose property I was a trespasser. They were too well brought up to lift their voices against the sacred right of preserving game, but they were kind-hearted girls, and they pitied me, and took me home with them. I remember the gentlemen of the house, keen sportsmen all of them, roaring with laughter as I went by the windows, crying, with my little dead dog in my arms. Don't suppose I complain of their laughter. It did me good service. It roused the indignation of the two ladies. One of them took me into her own garden, and showed me a place where I might bury my dog under the flowers, and be sure that no other hands should ever disturb him again. The other went to her father, and persuaded him to give the forlorn little vagabond a chance in the house, under one of the upper servants. Yes, you have been cruising in company with a man who was once a footboy. I saw you look at me when I amused Mr. Armadale by laying the cloth on board the yacht. Now you know why I laid it so neatly, and forgot nothing. It has been my good fortune to see something of society. I have helped to fill its stomach and black its boots. My experience of the servants' hall was not a long one. Before I had worn out my first suit of livery, there was a scandal in the house. It was the old story. There is no need to tell it again for the 1000th time. Loose money left on a table, and not found there again. All the servants with character to appeal to, except the footboy, who had been rashly taken on trial. Well, well, I was lucky in that house to the last. I was not prosecuted for taking what I had not only never touched, but never even seen. I was only turned out. One morning I went in my old clothes to the grave where I had buried Tommy. I gave the place a kiss. I said good-bye to my little dead dog, and there I was, out in the world again, at the ripe age of 13 years. "In that friendless state, and at that tender age," said Mr. Brock, "did no thought cross your mind of going home again?" I went home again, sir, that very night. I slept on the hillside. What other home had I? In a day or two's time I drifted back to the large towns and the bad company. The great open country was so lonely to me now I had lost the dogs. 2 sailors picked me up next. I was a handy lad, and I got a cabin boy's berth on board a coasting vessel. A cabin boy's berth means dirt to live in, offal to eat, a man's work on a boy's shoulders, and the rope's end at regular intervals. The vessel touched at a port in the Hebrides. I was as ungrateful as usual to my best benefactors. I ran away again. Some women found me, half dead of starvation, in the northern wilds of the Isle of Skye. It was near the coast, and I took a turn with the fishermen next. There was less of the rope's end among my new masters, but plenty of exposure to wind and weather, and hard work enough to have killed a boy who was not a seasoned tramp like me. I fought through it till the winter came, and then the fishermen turned me adrift again. I don't blame them. Food was scarce, and mouths were many. With famine staring the whole community in the face, why should they keep a boy who didn't belong to them? A great city was my only chance in the winter time, so I went to Glasgow, and all but stepped into the lion's mouth as soon as I got there. I was minding an empty cart on the Broomielaw, when I heard my stepfather's voice on the pavement side of the horse by which I was standing. He had met some person whom he knew, and, to my terror and surprise, they were talking about me. Hidden behind the horse, I heard enough of their conversation to know that I had narrowly escaped discovery before I went on board the coasting vessel. I had met at that time with another vagabond boy of my own age. We had quarreled and parted. The day after, my stepfather's inquiries were made in that very district, and it became a question with him. a good personal description being unattainable in either case, which of the two boys he should follow. One of them, he was informed, was known as Brown, and the other as Midwinter. Brown was just the common name which a cunning runaway boy would be most likely to assume; Midwinter, just the remarkable name which he would be most likely to avoid. The pursuit had accordingly followed Brown, and had allowed me to escape. I leave you to imagine whether I was not doubly and trebly determined to keep my gypsy master's name after that. But my resolution did not stop here. I made up my mind to leave the country altogether. After a day or two's lurking about the outward bound vessels in port, I found out which sailed first, and hid myself on board. Hunger tried hard to force me out before the pilot had left; but hunger was not new to me, and I kept my place. The pilot was out of the vessel when I made my appearance on deck, and there was nothing for it but to keep me or throw me overboard. The captain said, I have no doubt quite truly, that he would have preferred throwing me overboard; but the majesty of the law does sometimes stand the friend even of a vagabond like me. In that way I came back to a sea life. In that way I learned enough to make me handy and useful, as I saw you noticed, on board Mr. Armadale's yacht. I sailed more than one voyage, in more than one vessel, to more than one part of the world, and I might have followed the sea for life, if I could only have kept my temper under every provocation that could be laid on it. I had learned a great deal, but not having learned that, I made the last part of my voyage home to the port of Bristol in irons, and I saw the inside of a prison for the first time in my life, on a charge of mutinous conduct to one of the officers. You have heard me with extraordinary patience, sir, and I am glad to tell you in return that we are not far now from the end of my story. You found some books, if I remember right, when you searched my luggage at the Somersetshire Inn?" Mr. Brock answered in the affirmative. "Those books marked the next change in my life, and the last before I took the usher's place at the school. My term of imprisonment was not a long one. Perhaps my youth pleaded for me; perhaps the Bristol magistrates took into consideration the time I had passed in irons on board ship. Anyhow, I was just turned 17 when I found myself out on the world again. I had no friends to receive me; I had no place to go to. A sailor's life, after what had happened, was a life I recoiled from in disgust. I stood in the crowd on the bridge at Bristol, wondering what I should do with my freedom now I had got it back. Whether I had altered in the prison, or whether I was feeling the change in character that comes with coming manhood, I don't know; but the old reckless enjoyment of the old vagabond life seemed quite worn out of my nature. An awful sense of loneliness kept me wandering about Bristol, in horror of the quiet country, till after nightfall. I looked at the lights kindling in the parlor windows with a miserable envy of the happy people inside. A word of advice would have been worth something to me at that time. Well, I got it. A policeman advised me to move on. He was quite right. What else could I do? I looked up at the sky, and there was my old friend of many a night's watch at sea, the North Star. All points of the compass are alike to me, I thought to myself. I'll go your way. Not even the star could keep me company that night. It got behind a cloud, and left me alone in the rain and darkness. I groped my way to a cart shed, fell asleep, and dreamed of old times, when I served my gypsy master and lived with the dogs. God! What would I have given when I woke to have felt Tommy's little cold muzzle in my hand? Why am I dwelling on these things? Why don't I get on to the end? You shouldn't encourage me, sir, by listening so patiently. After a week more of wandering, without hope to help me or prospects to look to, I found myself in the streets of Shrewsbury, staring in at the windows of a bookseller's shop. An old man came to the shop door, looked about him, and saw me. "Do you want a job?" he asked. "And are you not above doing it cheap?" The prospect of having something to do, and some human creature to speak a word to, tempted me, and I did a day's dirty work in the bookseller's warehouse for a shilling. More work followed at the same rate. In a week I was promoted to sweep out the shop, and put up the shutters. In no very long time after, I was trusted to carry the books out, and when quarter day came, and the shopman left, I took his place. Wonderful luck, you will say. Here I had found my way to a friend at last. I had found my way to one of the most merciless misers in England, and I had risen in the little world of Shrewsbury by the purely commercial process of underselling all my competitors. The job in the warehouse had been declined at the price by every idle man in the town, and I did it. The regular porter received his weekly pittance under weekly protest. I took 2 shillings less, and made no complaint. The shopman gave warning on the ground that he was underfed as well as underpaid. I received half his salary, and lived contentedly on his reversionary scraps. Never were two men so well suited to each other as that bookseller and I. His one object in life was to find somebody who would work for him at starvation wages. My one object in life was to find someone who would give me an asylum over my head. Without a single sympathy in common, without a vestige of feeling of any sort, hostile or friendly, growing up between us on either side, without wishing each other good night when we parted on the house stairs, or good morning when we met at the shop counter, we lived alone in that house, strangers from first to last, for 2 whole years. A dismal existence for a lad of my age, was it not? You are a clergyman and a scholar. Surely you can guess what made the life endurable to me." Mr. Brock remembered the well-worn volumes which had been found in the usher's bag. "The books made it endurable to you," he said. The eyes of the castaway kindled with a new light. "Yes," he said, "the books, the generous friends who met me without suspicion, the merciful masters who never used me ill. The only years of my life that I can look back on with something like pride are the years I passed in the miser's house. The only unalloyed pleasure I have ever tasted is the pleasure that I found for myself on the miser's shelves. Early and late, through the long winter nights and the quiet summer days, I drank at the fountain of knowledge, and never wearied of the draught. There were few customers to serve, for the books were mostly of the solid and scholarly kind. No responsibilities rested on me, for the accounts were kept by my master, and only the small sums of money were suffered to pass through my hands. He soon found out enough of me to know that my honesty was to be trusted, and that my patience might be counted on, treat me as he might. The one insight into his character which I had obtained, on my side, widened the distance between us to its last limits. He was a confirmed opium eater in secret, a prodigal in laudanum, though a miser in all besides. He never confessed his frailty, and I never told him that I had found it out. He had his pleasure apart from me, and I had my pleasure apart from him. Week after week, month after month, there we sat, without a friendly word ever passing between us. I alone with my book at the counter, he alone with his ledger in the parlor, dimly visible to me through the dirty window-pane of the glass door, sometimes poring over his figures, sometimes lost and motionless for hours in the ecstasy of his opium trance. Time passed, and made no impression on us. The seasons of 2 years came and went, and found us still unchanged. One morning, at the opening of the 3rd year, my master did not appear, as usual, to give me my allowance for breakfast. I went upstairs, and found him helpless in his bed. He refused to trust me with the keys of the cupboard, or to let me send for a doctor. I bought a morsel of bread, and went back to my books, with no more feeling for him, I honestly confess it, than he would have had for me under the same circumstances. An hour or 2 later, I was roused from my reading by an occasional customer of ours, a retired medical man. He went upstairs. I was glad to get rid of him and return to my books. He came down again, and disturbed me once more. "I don't much like you, my lad," he said, "but I think it is my duty to say that you will soon have to shift for yourself. You are no great favorite in the town, and you may have some difficulty in finding a new place. Provide yourself with a written character from your master before it is too late." He spoke to me coldly. I thanked him coldly on my side, and got my character the same day. Do you think my master let me have it for nothing? Not he. He bargained with me on his deathbed. I was his creditor for a month's salary, and he wouldn't write a line of my testimonial until I had first promised to forgive him the debt. 3 days afterwards he died, enjoying to the last the happiness of having overreached his shopman. Ah, ha! he whispered, when the doctor formally summoned me to take leave of him. I got you cheap. Was Ozias Midwinter's stick as cruel as that? I think not. Well, there I was, out on the world again, but surely with better prospects this time. I had taught myself to read Latin, Greek, and German, and I had got my written character to speak for me. All useless. The doctor was quite right. I was not liked in the town. The lower order of the people despised me for selling my services to the miser at the miser's prices. As for the better classes, I did with them, God knows how, what I have always done with everybody except Mr. Armadale. I produced a disagreeable impression at first sight. I couldn't mend it afterwards, and there was an end of me in respectable quarters. It is quite likely I might have spent all my savings, my puny little golden offspring of 2 years' miserable growth, but for a school advertisement which I saw in a local paper. The heartlessly mean terms that were offered encouraged me to apply, and I got the place. How I prospered in it, and what became of me, there is no need to tell you. The thread of my story is all wound off. My vagabond life stands stripped of its mystery, and you know the worst of me at last." A moment of silence followed those closing words. Midwinter rose from the window seat, and came back to the table with the letter from Wildbad in his hand. Chapter 2, Part 1. Recording by Allan Winterowd. boomcoach.blogspot.com. Book 1, Chapter 2, Part 2 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Allan Winterowd. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 2, Part 2. My father's confession has told you who I am, and my own confession has told you what my life has been, he said, addressing Mr. Brock, without taking the chair to which the rector pointed. I promised to make a clean breast of it when I first asked leave to enter this room. Have I kept my word? It is impossible to doubt it, replied Mr. Brock. You have established your claim on my confidence and my sympathy. I should be insensible indeed if I could know what I now know of your childhood and your youth, and not feel something of Allan's kindness for Allan's friend. Thank you, sir, said Midwinter, simply and gravely. He sat down opposite Mr. Brock at the table for the first time. In a few hours you will have left this place, he proceeded. If I can help you to leave it with your mind at ease, I will. There is more to be said between us than we have said up to this time. My future relations with Mr. Armadale are still left undecided, and the serious question raised by my father's letter is a question which we have neither of us faced yet. He paused, and looked with a momentary impatience at the candle still burning on the table, in the morning light. The struggle to speak with composure, and to keep his own feelings stoically out of view, was evidently growing harder and harder to him. "It may possibly help your decision," he went on, "if I tell you how I determined to act towards Mr. Armadale, in the matter of the similarity of our names, when I first read this letter, and when I had composed myself sufficiently to be able to think at all." He stopped, and cast a second impatient look at the lighted candle. "Will you excuse the odd fancy of an odd man?" he asked, with a faint smile. "I want to put out the candle. I want to speak of the new subject in the new light." He extinguished the candle as he spoke, and let the first tenderness of the daylight flow uninterruptedly into the room. "I must once more ask your patience," he resumed, "if I return for a moment to myself and my circumstances. I have already told you that my stepfather made an attempt to discover me some years after I had turned my back on the Scotch school. He took that step out of no anxiety of his own, but simply as the agent of my father's trustees. In the exercise of their discretion, they had sold the estates in Barbados, at the time of the emancipation of the slaves and the ruin of West Indian property, for what the estates would fetch. Having invested the proceeds, they were bound to set aside a sum for my yearly education. This responsibility obliged them to make the attempt to trace me, a fruitless attempt, as you now know. A little later, as I have been since informed, I was publicly addressed by an advertisement in the newspapers, which I never saw. Later still, when I was 21, a second advertisement appeared, which I did see, offering a reward for evidence of my death. If I was alive, I had a right to my half share of the proceeds of the estates on coming of age. If dead, the money reverted to my mother. I went to the lawyers, and heard from them what I have just told you. After some difficulty in proving my identity, and after an interview with my stepfather, and a message from my mother which has hopelessly widened the old breach between us, my claim was allowed, and my money is now invested for me in the funds under the name that is really my own. Mr. Brock drew eagerly nearer to the table. He saw the end now to which the speaker was tending. "Twice a year," Midwinter pursued, "I must sign my own name to get my own income. At all other times, and under all other circumstances, I may hide my identity under any name I please. As Ozias Midwinter, Mr. Armadale first knew me. As Ozias Midwinter he shall know me to the end of my days. Whatever may be the result of this interview, whether I win your confidence or whether I lose it, of one thing you may feel sure: your pupil shall never know the horrible secret which I have trusted to your keeping. This is no extraordinary resolution, for, as you know already, it cost me no sacrifice of feeling to keep my assumed name. There is nothing in my conduct to praise; it comes naturally out of the gratitude of a thankful man. Review the circumstances for yourself, sir, and set my own horror of revealing them to Mr. Armadale out of the question. If the story of the names is ever told, there can be no limiting it to the disclosure of my father's crime. It must go back to the story of Mrs. Armadale's marriage. I have heard her son talk of her. I know how he loves her memory. As God is my witness, he shall never love it less dearly through me." Simply as the words were spoken, they touched the deepest sympathy in the rector's nature. They took his thoughts back to Mrs. Armadale's deathbed. There sat the man against whom she had ignorantly warned him in her son's interest, and that man, of his own free will, had laid on himself the obligation of respecting her secret for her son's sake. The memory of his own past efforts to destroy the very friendship out of which this resolution had sprung rose and reproached Mr. Brock. He held out his hand to Midwinter for the first time. "In her name, and in her son's name," he said, warmly, "I thank you." Without replying, Midwinter spread the confession open before him on the table. "I think I have said all that it was my duty to say," he began, "before we could approach the consideration of this letter. Whatever may have appeared strange in my conduct toward you and toward Mr. Armadale may now be trusted to explain itself. You can easily imagine the natural curiosity and surprise that I must have felt, ignorant as I then was of the truth, when the sound of Mr. Armadale's name first startled me as the echo of my own. You will readily understand that I only hesitated to tell him I was his namesake because I hesitated to damage my position, in your estimation if not in his, by confessing that I had come among you under an assumed name. And after all that you have just heard of my vagabond life and my low associates, you will hardly wonder at the obstinate silence I maintained about myself at a time when I did not feel the sense of responsibility which my father's confession has laid on me. We can return to those small personal explanations, if you wish, at another time. They cannot be suffered to keep us from the greater interests which we must settle before you leave this place. We may come now—" His voice faltered, and he suddenly turned his face toward the window, so as to hide it from the rector's view. "We may come now," he repeated, his hand trembling visibly as it held the page, to the murder on board the timber ship, and to the warning that has followed me from my father's grave." Softly, as if he feared they might reach Allan sleeping in the neighboring room, he read the last terrible words which the Scotchman's pen had written at Wildbad, as they fell from his father's lips: "Avoid the widow of the man I killed, if the widow still lives. Avoid the maid whose wicked hand smoothed the way to the marriage, if the maid is still in her service. And, more than all, avoid the man who bears the same name as your own. Offend your best benefactor, if that benefactor's influence has connected you one with the other. Desert the woman who loves you, if that woman is a link between you and him. Hide yourself from him under an assumed name. Put the mountains and the seas between you. Be ungrateful, be unforgiving, be all that is most repellent to your own gentler nature, rather than live under the same roof and breathe the same air with that man. Never let the two Allan Armadales meet in this world. Never, never, never." After reading those sentences, he pushed the manuscript from him without looking up. The fatal reserve, which he had been in a fair way of conquering but a few minutes since, possessed itself of him once more. Again his eyes wandered, again his voice sank in tone. A stranger who had heard his story, and who saw him now, would have said, "His look is lurking, his manner is bad, he is, every inch of him, his father's son." "I have a question to ask you," said Mr. Brock, breaking the silence between them on his side. "Why have you just read that passage in your father's letter?" "To force me into telling you the truth," was the answer. "You must know how much there is of my father in me before you trust me to be Mr. Armadale's friend. I got my letter yesterday in the morning. Some inner warning troubled me, and I went down on the seashore by myself before I broke the seal. Do you believe the dead can come back to the world they once lived in? I believe my father came back in that bright morning light, through the glare of that broad sunshine and the roar of that joyful sea, and watched me while I read. When I got to the words that you have just heard, and when I knew that the very end which he had died dreading was the end that had really come, I felt the horror that had crept over him in his last moments creeping over me. I struggled against myself, as he would have had me struggle. I tried to be all that was most repellent to my own gentler nature. I tried to think pitilessly of putting the mountains and the seas between me and the man who bore my name. Hours passed before I could prevail on myself to go back and run the risk of meeting Allan Armadale in this house. When I did get back, and when he met me at night on the stairs, I thought I was looking him in the face as my father looked his father in the face when the cabin door closed between them. Draw your own conclusions, sir. Say, if you like, that the inheritance of my father's heathen belief in fate is one of the inheritances he has left to me. I won't dispute it. I won't deny that all through yesterday his superstition was my superstition. The night came before I could find my way to calmer and brighter thoughts, but I did find my way. You may set it down in my favor that I lifted myself at last above the influence of this horrible letter. Do you know what helped me? Did you reason with yourself? I can't reason about what I feel. Did you quiet your mind by prayer? I was not fit to pray. And yet something guided you to the better feeling and the truer view? Something did. What was it? My love for Allan Armadale. He cast a doubting, almost a timid look at Mr. Brock as he gave that answer, and suddenly leaving the table, went back to the window-seat. "Have I no right to speak of him in that way?" he asked, keeping his face hidden from the rector. "Have I not known him long enough? Have I not done enough for him yet? Remember what my experience of other men had been when I first saw his hand held out to me, when I first heard his voice speaking to me in my sick-room. What had I known of strangers' hands all through my childhood? I had only known them as hands raised to threaten and to strike me. His hand put my pillow straight, and patted me on the shoulder, and gave me my food and drink. What had I known of other men's voices when I was growing up to be a man myself? I had only known them as voices that jeered, voices that cursed, voices that whispered in corners with a vile distrust. His voice said to me, 'Cheer up, Midwinter! We'll soon bring you round again. You'll be strong enough in a week to go out for a drive with me in our Somersetshire lanes. Think of the gypsy's stick. Think of the devils laughing at me when I went by their windows with my little dead dog in my arms. Think of the master who cheated me of my month's salary on his deathbed, and ask your own heart if the miserable wretch whom Allan Armadale has treated as his equal and his friend has said too much in saying that he loves him. I do love him. It will come out of me. I can't keep it back. I love the very ground he treads on. I would give my life, yes, the life that is precious to me now, because his kindness has made it a happy one. I tell you, I would give my life—" The next words died away on his lips. The hysterical passion rose and conquered him. He stretched out one of his hands with a wild gesture of entreaty to Mr. Brock. His head sank on the window-sill, and he burst into tears. Even then, the hard discipline of the man's life asserted itself. He expected no sympathy, he counted on no merciful human respect for human weakness. The cruel necessity of self-suppression was present to his mind while the tears were pouring over his cheeks. "Give me a minute," he said, faintly. "I'll fight it down in a minute. I won't distress you in this way again." True to his resolution, in a minute he had fought it down. In a minute more he was able to speak calmly. "We will get back, sir, to those better thoughts which have brought me from my room to yours," he resumed. "I can only repeat that I should never have torn myself from the hold which this letter fastened on me, if I had not loved Allan Armadale with all that I have in me of a brother's love. I said to myself, if the thought of leaving him breaks my heart, the thought of leaving him is wrong. That was some hours since, and I am in the same mind still. I can't believe, I won't believe, that a friendship which has grown out of nothing but kindness on one side, and nothing but gratitude on the other, is destined to lead to an evil end. Judge, you who are a clergyman, between the dead father, whose word is in these pages, and the living son, whose word is now on his lips. What is it appointed me to do, now that I am breathing the same air, and living under the same roof with the son of the man whom my father killed? To perpetuate my father's crime by mortally injuring him, or to atone for my father's crime by giving him the devotion of my whole life? The last of these two faiths is my faith, and shall be my faith, happen what may. In the strength of that better conviction, I have come here to trust you with my father's secret, and to confess the wretched story of my own life. In the strength of that better conviction, I can face you resolutely with the one plain question which marks the one plain end of all that I have come here to say. Your pupil stands at the starting point of his new career, in a position singularly friendless. His one great need is a companion of his own age on whom he can rely. The time has come, sir, to decide whether I am to be that companion or not. After all you have heard of Ozias Midwinter, tell me plainly, will you trust him to be Allan Armadale's friend?" Mr. Brock met that fearlessly frank question by a fearless frankness on his side. "I believe you love Allan," he said, "and I believe you have spoken the truth. A man who has produced that impression on me is a man whom I am bound to trust. I trust you." Midwinter started to his feet, his dark face flushing deep, his eyes fixed brightly and steadily at last on the rector's face. "A light!" he exclaimed, tearing the pages of his father's letter one by one from the fastening that held them. "Let us destroy the last link that holds us to the horrible past. Let us see this confession a heap of ashes before we part." "Wait," said Mr. Brock. "Before you burn it, there is a reason for looking at it once more." The parted leaves of the manuscript dropped from Midwinter's hands. Mr. Brock took them up and sorted them carefully until he found the last page. "I view your father's superstition as you view it," said the rector. "But there is a warning given you here which you will do well, for Allan's sake and for your own sake, not to neglect. The last link with the past will not be destroyed when you have burned these pages. One of the actors in this story of treachery and murder is not dead yet. Read those words." He pushed the page across the table, with his finger on one sentence. Midwinter's agitation misled him. He mistook the indication, and read, "Avoid the widow of the man I killed, if the widow still lives." "Not that sentence," said the rector. "The next." Midwinter read it. "Avoid the maid whose wicked hand smoothed the way to the marriage, if the maid is still in her service." "The maid and the mistress parted," said Mr. Brock, "at the time of the mistress's marriage. The maid and the mistress met again at Mrs. Armadale's residence in Somersetshire last year. I myself met the woman in the village, and I myself know that her visit hastened Mrs. Armadale's death. Wait a little and compose yourself. I see I have startled you." He waited as he was bid, his color fading away to a gray paleness, and the light in his clear brown eyes dying out slowly. What the rector had said had produced no transient impression on him. There was more than doubt, there was alarm in his face, as he sat lost in his own thought. Was the struggle of the past night renewing itself already? Did he feel the horror of his hereditary superstition creeping over him again? "Can you put me on my guard against her?" he asked, after a long interval of silence. "Can you tell me her name?" "I can only tell you what Mrs. Armadale told me," answered Mr. Brock. "The woman acknowledged having been married in the long interval since she and her mistress had last met, but not a word more escaped her about her past life. She came to Mrs. Armadale to ask for money under a plea of distress. She got the money, and she left the house, positively refusing, when the question was put to her, to mention her married name." "You saw her yourself in the village. What was she like?" "She kept her veil down. I can't tell you." "You can tell me what you did see?" "Certainly. I saw as she approached me that she moved very gracefully, that she had a beautiful figure, and that she was a little over the middle height. I noticed, when she asked me the way to Mrs. Armadale's house, that her manner was the manner of a lady, and that the tone of her voice was remarkably soft and winning. Lastly, I remember afterward that she wore a thick black veil, a black bonnet, a black silk dress, and a red Paisley shawl. I feel all the importance of your possessing some better means of identifying her than I can give you, but unhappily—" He stopped. Midwinter was leaning eagerly across the table, and Midwinter's hand was laid suddenly on his arm. "Is it possible that you know the woman?" asked Mr. Brock, surprised at the sudden change in his manner. "No." "What have I said, then, that has startled you so?" "Do you remember the woman who threw herself from the river steamer?" asked the other. "The woman who caused that succession of deaths which opened Allan Armadale's way to the Thorpe Ambrose estate?" "I remember the description of her in the police report," answered the rector. "That woman," pursued Midwinter, "moved gracefully, and had a beautiful figure. That woman wore a black veil, a black bonnet, a black silk gown, and a red Paisley shawl." He stopped, released his hold of Mr. Brock's arm, and abruptly resumed his chair. "Can it be the same?" he said to himself in a whisper. "Is there a fatality that follows men in the dark? And is it following us in that woman's footsteps?" If the conjecture was right, the one event in the past which had appeared to be entirely disconnected with the events that had preceded it was, on the contrary, the one missing link which made the chain complete. Mr. Brock's comfortable common sense instinctively denied that startling conclusion. He looked at Midwinter with a compassionate smile. "My young friend," he said, kindly, "have you cleared your mind of all superstition as completely as you think? Is what you have just said worthy of the better resolution at which you arrived last night?" Midwinter's head drooped on his breast. The color rushed back over his face. He sighed bitterly. "You are beginning to doubt my sincerity," he said. "I can't blame you." "I believe in your sincerity as firmly as ever," answered Mr. Brock. "I only doubt whether you have fortified the weak places in your nature as strongly as you yourself suppose. Many a man has lost the battle against himself far oftener than you have lost it yet, and has nevertheless won his victory in the end. I don't blame you, I don't distrust you. I only notice what has happened, to put you on your guard against yourself. Come, come, let your own better sense help you, and you will agree with me that there is really no evidence to justify the suspicion that the woman whom I met in Somersetshire and the woman who attempted suicide in London are one and the same. Need an old man like me remind a young man like you that there are thousands of women in England with beautiful figures, thousands of women who are quietly dressed in black silk gowns and red Paisley shawls?" Midwinter caught eagerly at the suggestion, too eagerly, as if it might have occurred to a harder critic on humanity than Mr. Brock. "You are quite right, sir," he said, "and I am quite wrong. Tens of thousands of women answer the description, as you say. I have been wasting time on my own idle fancies, when I ought to have been carefully gathering up facts. If this woman ever attempts to find her way to Allan, I must be prepared to stop her." He began searching restlessly among the manuscript leaves scattered about the table, paused over one of the pages, and examined it attentively. "This helps me to something positive," he went on. "This helps me to a knowledge of her age. She was 12 at the time of Mrs. Armadale's marriage. Add a year, and bring her to 13. Add Allan's age, 22, and we make her a woman of 35 at the present time. I know her age, and I know that she has her own reasons for being silent about her married life. This is something gained at the outset, and it may lead in time to something more." He looked up brightly again at Mr. Brock. "Am I in the right way now, sir? Am I doing my best to profit by the caution which you have kindly given me?" "You are vindicating your own better sense," answered the rector, encouraging him to trample down his own imagination, with an Englishman's ready distrust of the noblest of the human faculties. "You are paving the way for your own happier life." "Am I?" said the other thoughtfully. He searched among the papers once more, and stopped at another of the scattered pages. "The ship!" he explained, suddenly, his color changing again, and his manner altering on the instant. "What ship?" asked the rector. "The ship in which the deed was done," Midwinter answered, with the first signs of impatience that he had shown yet. "The ship in which my father's murderous hand turned the lock of the cabin door." "What of it?" said Mr. Brock. He appeared not to hear the question. His eyes remained fixed intently on the page that he was reading. "A French vessel, employed in the timber trade," he said, still speaking to himself. "A French vessel named La Grace de Dieu. If my father's belief had been the right belief, if the fatality had been following me step by step from my father's grave, in one or another of my voyages, I should have fallen in with that ship." He looked up again at Mr. Brock. "I am quite sure about it now," he said. "Those women are two, and not one." Mr. Brock shook his head. "I am glad you have come to that conclusion," he said, "but I wish you had reached it in some other way." Midwinter started passionately to his feet, and, seizing on the pages of the manuscript with both hands, flung them into the empty fireplace. "For God's sake, let me burn it!" he exclaimed. "As long as there is a page left I shall read it, and as long as I read it my father gets the better of me in spite of myself." Mr. Brock pointed to the matchbox. In another moment the confession was in flames. When the fire had consumed the last morsel of paper, Midwinter drew a deep breath of relief. "I may say, like Macbeth, 'Why so, being gone, I am a man again!'" he broke out with a feverish gaiety. "You look fatigued, sir, and no wonder," he added, in a lower tone. "I have kept you too long from your rest. I will keep you no longer. Depend on my remembering what you have told me. Depend on my standing between Allan and any enemy, man or woman, who comes near him. Thank you, Mr. Brock. 1,000,000 times thank you. I came into this room the most wretched of living men. I can leave it now as happy as the birds that are singing outside." As he turned to the door, the rays of the rising sun streamed through the window, and touched the heap of ashes lying black in the black fireplace. The sensitive imagination of Midwinter kindled instantly at the sight. "Look!" he said, joyously. "The promise of the future shining over the ashes of the past!" An inexplicable pity for the man, at the moment of his life when he needed pity least, stole over the rector's heart when the door had closed, and he was left by himself again. "Poor fellow!" he said, with an uneasy surprise at his own compassionate impulse. "Poor fellow!" End of Chapter 2, Part 2. Recording by Allan Winterowd. Boomcoach.blogspot.com. Book 1, Chapter 3 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Allan Winterowd. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 3, Day and Night. The morning hours had passed. The noon had come and gone, and Mr. Brock had started on the first stage of his journey home. After parting from the rector in Douglas Harbor, the two young men had returned to Castletown, and had there separated at the hotel door, Allan walking down to the waterside to look after his yacht, and Midwinter entering the house to get the rest that he needed after a sleepless night. He darkened his room. He closed his eyes, but no sleep came to him. On this first day of the rector's absence, his sensitive nature extravagantly exaggerated the responsibility which he now held in trust for Mr. Brock. A nervous dread of leaving Allan by himself, even for a few hours only, kept him waking and doubting, until it became a relief rather than a hardship to rise from the bed again, and, following in Allan's footsteps, to take his way to the waterside which led to the yacht. The repairs of the little vessel were nearly completed. It was a breezy, cheerful day. The land was bright, the water was blue, the quick waves leaped crisply in the sunshine, the men were singing at their work. Descending to the cabin, Midwinter discovered his friend busily occupied in attempting to set the place to rights. Habitually the least systematic of mortals, Allan now and then awoke to an overwhelming sense of the advantages of order, and on such occasions a perfect frenzy of tidiness possessed him. He was down on his knees, hotly and wildly at work, when Midwinter looked in on him, and was fast reducing the neat little world of the cabin to its original elements of chaos, with a misdirected energy wonderful to see. "Here's a mess!" said Allan, rising composedly on the horizon of his own accumulated litter. "Do you know, my dear fellow, I begin to wish I had let well alone." Midwinter smiled, and came to his friend's assistance, with the natural neat-handedness of a sailor. The first object that he encountered was Allan's dressing-case, turned upside down, with half the contents scattered on the floor, and with a duster and a hearth-broom lying among them. Replacing the various objects which formed the furniture of the dressing-case one by one, Midwinter lighted unexpectedly on a miniature portrait, of the old-fashioned oval form, primly framed in a setting of small diamonds. "You don't seem to set much value on this," he said. "What is it?" Allan bent over him, and looked at the miniature. "It belonged to my mother," he answered, "and I set the greatest value on it. It is a portrait of my father." Midwinter put the miniature abruptly into Allan's hands, and withdrew to the opposite side of the cabin. "You know best where the things ought to be put in your own dressing-case," he said, keeping his back turned on Allan. "I'll make the place tidy on this side of the cabin, and you shall make the place tidy on the other." He began setting in order the litter scattered about him on the cabin table and on the floor. But it seemed as if fate had decided that his friend's personal possessions should fall into his hands that morning, employ them where he might. One among the first objects which he took up was Allan's tobacco jar, with the stopper missing, and with a letter, which appeared by the bulk of it to contain enclosures, crumpled into the mouth of the jar in the stopper's place. "Do you know that you had put this in here?" he asked. "Is the letter of any importance?" Allan recognized it immediately. It was the first of the little series of letters which had followed the cruising party to the Isle of Man, the letters which young Armadale had briefly referred to as bringing him more worries from those everlasting lawyers, and had then dismissed from further notice as recklessly as usual. "This is what becomes of being particularly careful," said Allan. "Here is an instance of my extreme thoughtfulness. You may not think it, but I put the letter there on purpose. Every time I went to the jar, you know, I was sure to see the letter, and every time I saw the letter I was sure to say to myself, 'This must be answered.' There's nothing to laugh at. It was a perfectly sensible arrangement, if I could only have remembered where I put the jar. Suppose I tie a knot in my pocket handkerchief this time. You have a wonderful memory, my dear fellow. Perhaps you'll remind me in the course of the day, in case I forget the knot next." Midwinter saw his first chance, since Mr. Brock's departure, of usefully filling Mr. Brock's place. "Here is your writing case," he said. "Why not answer the letter at once? If you put it away again, you may forget it again." "Very true," returned Allan. "But the worst of it is, I can't quite make up my mind what answer to write. I want a word of advice. Come and sit down here, and I'll tell you all about it." With his loud boyish laugh, echoed by Midwinter, who caught the infection of his gaiety, he swept a heap of miscellaneous encumbrances off the cabin sofa, and made room for his friend and himself to take their places. In the high flow of youthful spirits, the two sat down to their trifling consolation over a letter lost in a tobacco jar. It was a memorable moment to both of them, lightly as they thought of it at the time. Before they had risen again from their places, they had taken the first irrevocable step together on the dark and tortuous road of their future lives. Reduced to plain facts, the question on which Allan now required his friend's advice may be stated as follows. While the various arrangements connected with the succession to Thorpe Ambrose were in progress of settlement, and while the new possessor of the estate was still in London, a question had necessarily arisen relating to the person who should be appointed to manage the property. The steward employed by the Blanchard family had written, without loss of time, to offer his services. Although a perfectly competent and trustworthy man, he failed to find favor in the eyes of the new proprietor. Acting as usual on his first impulses, and resolved at all hazards to install Midwinter as a permanent inmate at Thorpe Ambrose, Allan had determined that the steward's place was the place exactly fitted for his friend, for the simple reason that it would necessarily oblige his friend to live with him on the estate. He had accordingly written to decline the proposal made to him without consulting Mr. Brock, whose disapproval he had good reason to fear, and without telling Midwinter, who would probably, if a chance were allowed him of choosing, have declined taking a situation which his previous training had by no means fitted him to fill. Further correspondence had followed this decision, and had raised two new difficulties which looked a little embarrassing on the face of them, but which Allan, with the assistance of his lawyer, easily contrived to solve. The first difficulty, of examining the outgoing steward's books, was settled by sending a professional accountant to Thorpe Ambrose, and the second difficulty, of putting the steward's empty cottage to some profitable use (Allan's plans for his friend comprehending Midwinter's residence under his own roof), was met by placing the cottage on the list of an active house agent in the neighboring county town. In this state the arrangements had been left when Allan quitted London. He had heard and thought nothing more of the matter until a letter from his lawyers had followed him to the Isle of Man, enclosing two proposals to occupy the cottage, both received on the same day, and requesting to hear, at his earliest convenience, which of the two he was prepared to accept. Finding himself, after having conveniently forgotten the subject for some days past, placed face to face once more with the necessity for decision, Allan now put the two proposals into his friend's hands, and, after a rambling explanation of the circumstances of the case, requested to be favored with a word of advice. Instead of examining the proposals, Midwinter unceremoniously put them aside, and asked the two very natural and very awkward questions of who the new steward was to be, and why he was to live in Allan's house. "I'll tell you who, and I'll tell you why when we get to Thorpe Ambrose," said Allan. "In the meantime, we'll call the steward XYZ, and we'll say he lives with me because I'm devilish sharp, and I mean to keep him under my own eye. You needn't look surprised. I know the man thoroughly well. He requires a good deal of management. If I offered him the steward's place beforehand, his modesty would get in his way, and he would say no. If I pitch him into it neck and crop, without a word of warning, and with nobody at hand to relieve him of the situation, he'll have nothing for it but to consult my interests, and say yes. XYZ is not at all a bad fellow, I can tell you. You'll see him when we go to Thorpe Ambrose, and I rather think you and he will get on uncommonly well together." The humorous twinkle in Allan's eye, the sly significance in Allan's voice would have betrayed his secret to a prosperous man. Midwinter was as far from suspecting it as the carpenters who were at work above them on the deck of the yacht. "Is there no steward now on the estate?" he asked, his face showing plainly that he was far from feeling satisfied with Allan's answer. "Is the business neglected all this time?" "Nothing of the sort," returned Allan. "The business is going with a wet sheet and a flowing sea and a wind that follows free. I'm not joking. I'm only metaphorical. A regular accountant has poked his nose into the books, and a steady-going lawyer's clerk attends at the office once a week. That doesn't look like neglect, does it? Leave the new steward alone for the present, and just tell me which of those two tenants you would take if you were in my place." Midwinter opened their proposals, and read them attentively. The first proposal was from no less a person than the solicitor at Thorpe Ambrose, who had first informed Allan at Paris of the large fortune that had fallen into his hands. This gentleman wrote personally to say that he had long admired the cottage, which was charmingly situated within the limits of the Thorpe Ambrose grounds. He was a bachelor of studious habits, desirous of retiring to a country seclusion after the wear and tear of his business hours, and he ventured to say that Mr. Armadale, in accepting him as a tenant, might count on securing an unobtrusive neighbor, and on putting the cottage into responsible and careful hands. The second proposal came through the house agent, and proceeded from a total stranger. The tenant who offered for the cottage, in this case, was a retired officer in the army, one Major Milroy. His family merely consisted of an invalid wife and an only child, a young lady. His references were unexceptional, and he too was especially anxious to secure the cottage, as the perfect quiet of the situation was exactly what was required by Mrs. Milroy in her feeble state of health. "Well, which profession shall I favor?" asked Allan. "The army or the law?" "There seems to me to be no doubt about it," said Midwinter. "The lawyer has been already in correspondence with you, and the lawyer's claim is, therefore, the claim to be preferred." "I knew you would say that. In all the thousands of times I have asked other people for advice, I never yet got the advice I wanted. Here's the business of letting the cottage as an instance. I'm all on the other side myself. I want to have the major." "Why?" Young Armadale laid his forefinger on that part of the agent's letter which enumerated Major Milroy's family, and which contained the three words, "a young lady." "A bachelor of studious habits walking about my grounds," said Allan, "is not an interesting object. A young lady is. I have not the least doubt Miss Milroy is a charming girl. Ozias Midwinter of the serious countenance! Think of her pretty muslin dress flitting about amongst your trees, and committing trespasses on your property. Think of her adorable feet trotting into your fruit garden, and her delicious fresh lips kissing your ripe peaches. Think of her dimpled hands among your early violets, and her little cream-colored nose buried in your blush roses. What does the studious bachelor offer me in exchange for the loss of all this? He offers me a rheumatic brown object in gaiters and a wig. No, no! Justice is good, my dear friend, but, believe me, Miss Milroy is better." "Can you be serious about any mortal thing, Allan?" "I'll try to be, if you like. I know I ought to take the lawyer, but what can I do if the major's daughter keeps running in my head?" Midwinter turned resolutely to the just and sensible view of the matter, and pressed it on his friend's attention with all the persuasion of which he was master. After listening with exemplary patience until he had done, Allan swept a supplementary accumulation of litter off the cabin table, and produced from his waistcoat pocket a half-crown coin. "I've got an entirely new idea," he said. "Let's leave it to chance." The absurdity of the proposal, as coming from a landlord, was irresistible. Midwinter's gravity deserted him. "I'll spin," continued Allan, "and you shall call. We must give precedence to the army, of course, so we'll say heads the major, tails the lawyer. One spin to decide. Now then, look out!" He spun the half crown on the cabin table. "Tails!" cried Midwinter, humoring what he believed to be one of Allan's boyish jokes. The coin fell on the table with the head uppermost. "You don't mean to say you are really in earnest?" said Midwinter, as the other opened his writing case and dipped his pen in the ink. "Oh, but I am, though," replied Allan. "Chance is on my side and Miss Milroy's, and you're outvoted 2-1. It's no use arguing. The major has fallen uppermost, and the major shall have the cottage. I won't leave it to the lawyers; they'll only be worrying me with more letters. I'll write myself." He wrote his answers to the two proposals literally in 2 minutes. One to the house agent: "Dear sir, I accept Major Milroy's offer. Let him come in when he pleases. Yours truly, Allan Armadale." And one to the lawyer: "Dear sir, I regret that circumstances prevent me from accepting your proposal. Yours truly, etc." "People make a fuss about letter writing," Allan remarked when he had done. "I find it easy enough." He wrote the addresses on his 2 notes, and stamped them for the post, whistling gayly. While he had been writing he had not noticed how his friend was occupied. When he had done, it struck him that a sudden silence had fallen on the cabin, and, looking up, he observed that Midwinter's whole attention was strangely concentrated on the half crown as it lay head uppermost on the table. Allan suspended his whistling in astonishment. "What on earth are you doing?" he asked. "I was only wondering," replied Midwinter. "What about?" persisted Allan. "I was wondering," said the other, handing him back the half crown, "whether there is such a thing as chance." Half an hour later the 2 notes were posted, and Allan, whose close superintendence of the repairs of the yacht had hitherto allowed him but little leisure time on shore, had proposed to while away the idle hours by taking a walk in Castletown. Even Midwinter's nervous anxiety to deserve Mr. Brock's confidence in him could detect nothing objectionable in this harmless proposal, and the young men set forth together to see what they could make of the metropolis of the Isle of Man. It is doubtful if there is a place on the habitable globe which, regarded as a sight-seeing investment offering itself to the spare attention of strangers, yields so small a percentage of interest in return as Castletown. Beginning with the waterside, there was an inner harbor to see, with a drawbridge to let vessels through; an outer harbor ending in a dwarf lighthouse; a view of a flat coast to the right, and a view of a flat coast to the left. In the central solitudes of the city there was a squat gray building called the Castle; also a memorial pillar dedicated to one Governor Smelt, with a flat top for a statue, and no statue standing on it; also a barrack holding the half company of soldiers allotted to the island, and exhibiting one spirit-broken sentry at its lonely door. The prevalent color of the town was faint gray. The few shops open were parted at frequent intervals by other shops closed and deserted in despair. The weary lounging of boatmen on shore was trebly weary here. The youth of the district smoked together in speechless depression under the lee of a dead wall. The ragged children said mechanically, "Give us a penny," and before the charitable hand could search the merciful pocket, lapsed away again in misanthropic doubt of the human nature they addressed. The silence of the grave overflowed the churchyard, and filled this miserable town. But one edifice, prosperous to look at, rose consolatory in the desolation of those dreadful streets. Frequented by the students of the neighboring College of King William, this building was naturally dedicated to the uses of a pastry-cook's shop. Here, at least, viewed through the friendly medium of the window, there was something going on for a stranger to see; for here, on high stools, the pupils of the college sat, with swinging legs and slowly moving jaws, and, hushed in the horrid stillness of Castletown, gorged their pastry gravely in an atmosphere of awful silence. "Hang me if I can look any longer at the boys and the tarts," said Allan, dragging his friend away from the pastry-cook's shop. Let's try if we can't find something else to amuse us in the next street." The first amusing object which the next street presented was a carver and gilder's shop, expiring feebly in the last stage of commercial decay. The counter inside displayed nothing to view but the recumbent head of a boy peacefully asleep in the unbroken solitude of the place. In the window were exhibited to the passing stranger 3 forlorn little fly-spotted frames, a small posting bill, dusty with long continued neglect, announcing that the premises were to let, and one colored print, the last of a series illustrating the horrors of drunkenness, on the fiercest temperance principles. The composition, representing an empty bottle of gin, an immensely spacious garret, a perpendicular scripture reader, and a horizontal expiring family, appealed to public favor under the entirely unobjectionable title of "The Hand of Death." Allan's resolution to extract amusement from Castletown by main force had resisted a great deal, but it failed him at this stage of the investigations. He suggested trying an excursion to some other place. Midwinter readily agreeing, they went back to the hotel to make inquiries. Thanks to the mixed influence of Allan's ready gift of familiarity, and total want of method in putting his questions, a perfect deluge of information flowed in on the two strangers, relating to every subject but the subject which had actually brought them to the hotel. They made various interesting discoveries in connection with the laws and constitution of the Isle of Man, and the manners and customs of the natives. To Allan's delight, the Manxmen spoke of England as of a well-known adjacent island situated at a certain distance from the central empire of the Isle of Man. It was further revealed to the two Englishmen that this happy little nation rejoiced in laws of its own, publicly proclaimed once a year by the governor and the two head judges, grouped together on top of an ancient mound, in fancy costumes appropriate to the occasion. Possessing this enviable institution, the island added to it the inestimable blessing of a local parliament, called the House of Keys, an assembly far in advance of the other parliament belonging to the neighboring island in this respect, that the members dispensed with the people and solemnly elected each other. With these and many more local particulars, extracted from all sorts and conditions of men in and about the hotel, Allan whiled away the weary time in his own essentially desultory manner, until the gossip died out of itself, and Midwinter, who had been speaking apart with the landlord, quietly recalled him to the matter in hand. The finest coast scenery in the island was said to be the westward and the southward, and there was a fishing town in those regions called Port St. Mary, with a hotel at which travelers could sleep. If Allan's impressions of Castletown still inclined him to try an excursion to some other place, he had only to say so, and a carriage would be produced immediately. Allan jumped at the proposal, and in 10 minutes more he and Midwinter were on their way to the western wilds of the island. With trifling incidents, the day of Mr. Brock's departure had worn on thus far. With trifling incidents, in which not even Midwinter's nervous watchfulness could see anything to distrust, it was still to proceed until the night came, a night which one at least of the two companions was destined to remember to the end of his life. Before the companions had advanced 2 miles on their road, an accident happened. The horse fell, and the driver reported that the animal had seriously injured himself. There was no alternative but to send for another carriage to Castletown, or to get on to Port St. Mary on foot. Deciding to walk, Midwinter and Allan had not gone far before they were overtaken by a gentleman driving alone in an open chaise. He civilly introduced himself as a medical man, living close to Port St. Mary, and offered seats in his carriage. Always ready to make new acquaintances, Allan at once accepted the proposal. He and the doctor, whose name was ascertained to be Hawbury, became friendly and familiar before they had been 5 minutes in the chaise together, Midwinter sitting behind them reserved and silent on the back seat. They separated just outside Port St. Mary, before Mr. Hawbury's house, Allan boisterously admiring the doctor's neat French windows and pretty flower garden and lawn, and wringing his hand at parting as if they had known each other from boyhood upward. Arrived in Port St. Mary, the two friends found themselves in a second castle town on a smaller scale; but the country round, wild, open, and hilly, deserved its reputation. A walk brought them well enough on with the day, still the harmless, idle day that it had been from the first, to see the evening near at hand. After waiting a little to admire the sun, setting grandly over hill and heath and crag, and talking, while they waited, of Mr. Brock and his long journey home, they returned to the hotel to order their early supper. Nearer and nearer the night, and the adventure which the night was to bring with it, came to the two friends, and still the only incidents that happened were incidents to be laughed at if they were noticed at all. The supper was badly cooked, the waiting-maid was impenetrably stupid, the old-fashioned bell-rope in the coffee-room had come down in Allan's hands, and, striking in its descent a painted china shepherdess on the chimney-piece, had laid the figure in fragments on the floor. Events as trifling as these were still the only events that had happened, when the twilight faded and the lighted candles were brought into the room. Finding Midwinter, after the double fatigue of a sleepless night and a restless day, but little inclined for conversation, Allan left him resting on the sofa, and lounged into the passage of the hotel on the chance of discovering somebody to talk to. Here another of the trivial incidents of the day brought Allan and Mr. Hawbury together again, and helped, whether happily or not yet remained to be seen, to strengthen the acquaintance between them on either side. The bar of the hotel was situated at one end of the passage, and the landlady was in attendance there, mixing a glass of liquor for the doctor, who had just looked in for a little gossip. On Allan's asking permission to make a third in the drinking and the gossiping, Mr. Hawbury civilly handed him the glass which the landlady had just filled. It contained cold brandy and water. A marked change in Allan's face, as he suddenly drew back and asked for a whisky instead, caught the doctor's medical eye. "A case of nervous antipathy," said Mr. Hawbury, quietly taking the glass away again. The remark obliged Allan to acknowledge that he had an insurmountable loathing, which he was foolish enough to be a little ashamed of mentioning, to the smell and taste of brandy. No matter with what diluting fluid the spirit was mixed, the presence of it, instantly detected by his organs of taste and smell, turned him sick and faint if the drink touched his lips. Starting from this personal confession, the talk turned on antipathies in general, and the doctor acknowledged, on his side, that he took a professional interest in the subject, and that he possessed a collection of curious cases at home, which his new acquaintance was welcome to look at, if Allan had nothing else to do that evening, and if he would call when the medical work of the day was over, in an hour's time. Cordially accepting the invitation, which was extended to Midwinter also, if he cared to profit by it, Allan returned to the coffee-room to look after his friend. Half asleep and half awake, Midwinter was still stretched on the sofa, with the local newspaper just dropping out of his languid hand. "I heard your voice in the passage," he said, drowsily. "Whom were you talking to?" "The doctor," replied Allan. "I am going to smoke a cigar with him in an hour's time. Will you come too?" Midwinter assented with a weary sigh. Always shyly unwilling to make new acquaintances, fatigue increased the reluctance he now felt to become Mr. Hawbury's guest. As matters stood, however, there was no alternative but to go, for with Allan's constitutional imprudence there was no safely trusting him alone anywhere, and more especially in a stranger's house. Mr. Brock would certainly not have left his pupil to visit the doctor alone, and Midwinter was still nervously conscious that he occupied Mr. Brock's place. "What shall we do till it's time to go?" asked Allan, looking about him. "Anything in this?" he added, observing the fallen newspaper, and picking it up from the floor. "I'm too tired to look. If you find anything interesting, read it out," said Midwinter, thinking that the reading might help to keep him awake. Part of the newspaper, and no small part of it, was devoted to extracts from books recently published in London. One of the works most largely laid under contribution in this manner was of the sort to interest Allan. It was a highly spiced narrative of traveling adventures in the wilds of Australia. Pouncing on an extract which described the sufferings of the traveling party lost in a trackless wilderness and in danger of dying by thirst, Allan announced that he had found something to make his friend's flesh creep, and began eagerly to read the passage aloud. Resolute not to sleep, Midwinter followed the progress of the adventure, sentence by sentence, without missing a word. The consultation of the lost travelers, with death by thirst staring them in the face; the resolution to press on while their strength lasted; the fall of a heavy shower; the vain efforts made to catch the rain-water; the transient relief experienced by sucking their wet clothes; the sufferings renewed a few hours after; the night advance of the strongest of the party, leaving the weakest behind; the following a flight of birds when morning dawned; the discovery by the lost men of the broad pool of water that saved their lives; all this Midwinter's fast failing attention mastered painfully, Allan's voice growing fainter and fainter on his ear with every sentence that was read. Soon the next words seemed to drop away gently, and nothing but the slowly sinking sound of the voice was left. Then the light in the room darkened gradually, the sound dwindled into delicious silence, and the last waking impression of the weary Midwinter came peacefully to an end. The next event of which he was conscious was a sharp ringing at the closed door of the hotel. He started to his feet with the ready alacrity of a man whose life has accustomed him to wake at the shortest notice. An instant's look round showed him that the room was empty, and a glance at his watch told him that it was close on midnight. The noise made by the sleepy servant in opening the door, and the tread the next moment of quick footsteps in the passage, filled him with a sudden foreboding of something wrong. As he hurriedly stepped forward to go out and make inquiry, the door of the coffee-room opened, and the doctor stood before him. "I'm sorry to disturb you," said Mr. Hawbury. "Don't be alarmed. There's nothing wrong." "Where is my friend?" asked Midwinter. "At the pier head," answered the doctor. "I am, to a certain extent, responsible for what he is doing now, and I think some careful person like yourself ought to be with him." The hint was enough for Midwinter. He and the doctor set out for the pier immediately, Mr. Hawbury mentioning on the way the circumstances under which he had come to the hotel. Punctual to the appointed hour, Allan had made his appearance at the doctor's house, explaining that he had left his weary friend so fast asleep on the sofa that he had not had the heart to wake him. The evening had passed pleasantly, and the conversation had turned on many subjects, until, in an evil hour, Mr. Hawbury had dropped a hint which showed that he was fond of sailing, and that he possessed a pleasure boat of his own in the harbor. Excited on the instant by his favorite topic, Allan had left his host no hospitable alternative but to take him to the pier-head and show him the boat. The beauty of the night and the softness of the breeze had done the rest of the mischief. They had filled Allan with irresistible longings for a sail by moonlight. Prevented from accompanying his guest by professional hindrances which obliged him to remain on shore, the doctor, not knowing what else to do, had ventured on disturbing Midwinter rather than take the responsibility of allowing Mr. Armadale, no matter how well he might be accustomed to the sea, to set off on a sailing trip at midnight entirely by himself. The time taken to make this explanation brought Midwinter and the doctor to the pier-head. There, sure enough, was young Armadale in the boat, hoisting the sail, and singing the sailor's "Yo heave ho!" at the top of his voice. "Come along, old boy!" cried Allan. "You're just in time for a frolic by moonlight." Midwinter suggested a frolic by daylight, and an adjournment to bed in the meantime. "Bed!" cried Allan, on whose harum-scarum high spirits Mr. Hawbury's hospitality had certainly not produced a sedative effect. "Hear him, doctor! One would think he was 90. Bed, you drowsy old dormouse! Look at that, and think of bed if you can." He pointed to the sea. The moon was shining in the cloudless heaven, the night breeze blew soft and steady from the land, the peaceful waters rippled joyfully in the silence and the glory of the night. Midwinter turned to the doctor with a wise resignation to circumstances. He had seen enough to satisfy him that all words of remonstrance would be words simply thrown away. How is the tide? He asked. Mr. Hawbury told him. Are there oars in the boat? Yes. I am well used to the sea, said Midwinter, descending the pier steps. You may trust me to take care of my friend, and to take care of the boat. Good night, doctor, shouted Allan. Your whiskey and water is delicious, your little boat's a little beauty, and you are the best fellow I ever met in my life. The doctor laughed and waved his hand, and the boat glided out from the harbor with Midwinter at the helm. As the breeze then blew, they were soon abreast of the westward headland, bounding the bay of Poolvash, and the question was started whether they should run out to sea or keep along the shore. The wisest proceeding, in the event of the wind failing them, was to keep by the land. Midwinter altered the course of the boat, and they sailed on smoothly in a southwesterly direction, abreast of the coast. Little by little the cliffs rose in height, and the rocks, massed wild and jagged, showed rifted black chasms yawning deep in their seaward sides. Off the bold promontory called Spanish Head, Midwinter looked ominously at his watch, but Allan pleaded hard for half an hour more, and for a glance at the famous channel of the Sound, which they were now fast nearing, and of which he had heard some startling stories from the workmen employed on his yacht. The new change which Midwinter's compliance with this request rendered it necessary to make in the course of the boat brought her close to the wind, and revealed on one side the grand view of the southernmost shores of the Isle of Man, and, on the other, the black precipices of the islet called the Calf, separated from the mainland by the dark and dangerous channel of the Sound. Once more Midwinter looked at his watch. "We have gone far enough," he said. "Stand by the sheet." "Stop!" cried Allan, from the bows of the boat. "Good God! Here's a wrecked ship right ahead of us!" Midwinter let the boat fall off a little, and looked where the other pointed. There, stranded midway between the rocky boundaries on either side of the Sound, there, never again to rise on the living waters from her grave on the sunken rock, lost and lonely in the quiet night, high and dark and ghostly in the yellow moonshine, lay the wrecked ship. "I know the vessel," said Allan, in great excitement. "I heard my workmen talking of her yesterday. She drifted in here on a pitch-dark night when they couldn't see the lights. A poor old worn-out merchantman, Midwinter, that the ship-brokers have bought to break up. Let's run in and have a look at her." Midwinter hesitated. All the old sympathies of his sea life strongly inclined him to follow Allan's suggestion, but the wind was falling light, and he distrusted the broken water and the swirling currents of the channel ahead. "This is an ugly place to take a boat into when you know nothing about it," he said. "Nonsense!" returned Allan. "It's as light as day, and we float in 2 feet of water." Before Midwinter could answer, the current caught the boat and swept them onward through the channel straight toward the wreck. "Lower the sail," said Midwinter, quietly, "and ship the oars. We are running down on her fast enough now, whether we like it or not." Both well accustomed to the use of the oar, they brought the course of the boat under sufficient control to keep her on the smoothest side of the channel, the side which was nearest to the islet of the Calf. As they came swiftly up with the wreck, Midwinter resigned his oar to Allan, and, watching his opportunity, caught a hold with the boat-hook on the fore-chains of the vessel. The next moment they had the boat safely in hand under the lee of the wreck. The ship's ladder used by the workmen hung over the fore-chains. Mounting it, with the boat's rope in his teeth, Midwinter secured one end, and lowered the other to Allan in the boat. "Make that fast," he said, "and wait till I see if it's safe on board." With those words he disappeared behind the bulwark. "Wait?" repeated Allan, in the blankest astonishment at his friend's excessive caution. "What on earth does he mean? I'll be hanged if I wait. Where one of us goes, the other goes too." He hitched the loose end of the rope round the forward thwart of the boat, and, swinging himself up the ladder, stood the next moment on the deck. "Anything very dreadful on board?" he inquired sarcastically, as he and his friend met. Midwinter smiled. "Nothing whatever," he replied. "But I couldn't be sure that we were to have the whole ship to ourselves till I got over the bulwark and looked about me." Allan took a turn on the deck, and surveyed the wreck critically from stem to stern. Not much of a vessel, he said. The Frenchmen generally build better ships than this. Midwinter crossed the deck, and eyed Allan in a momentary silence. Frenchman? He repeated, after an interval. Is this vessel French? Yes. How do you know? The men I have got at work on the yacht told me. They know all about her. Midwinter came a little nearer. His swarthy face began to look, to Allan's eyes, unaccountably pale in the moonlight. Did they mention what trade she was engaged in? Yes, the timber trade. As Allan gave that answer, Midwinter's lean brown hand clutched him fast by the shoulder, and Midwinter's teeth chattered in his head like the teeth of a man struck by a sudden chill. "Did they tell you her name?" he asked, in a voice dropped suddenly to a whisper. "They did, I think, but it has slipped my memory. Gently, old fellow. These long claws of yours are rather tight on my shoulder." Was the name— He stopped, removed his hand, and dashed away the great drops that were gathered on his forehead. Was the name La Grace de Dieu? "How the deuce did you come to know it? That's the name, sure enough. La Grace de Dieu." At one bound, Midwinter leaped upon the bulwark of the wreck. "The boat!" he cried, with a scream of horror that rang far and wide through the stillness of the night, and brought Allan instantly to his side. The lower end of the carelessly hitched rope was loose on the water, and ahead, in the track of the moonlight, a small black object was floating out of view. The boat was adrift. End of Chapter 3. Recording by Allan Winterowd. boomcoach.blogspot.com Book 1, Chapter 4, Part 1 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Allan Winterowd. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Past. One stepping back under the dark shelter of the bulwark, and one standing out boldly in the yellow light of the moon, the two friends turned face to face on the deck of the timber ship, and looked at each other in silence. The next moment, Allan's inveterate recklessness seized on the grotesque side of the situation by main force. He seated himself astride on the bulwark, and burst out boisterously into his loudest and heartiest laugh. "All my fault," he said, "but there's no help for it now. Here we are, hard and fast in a trap of our own setting, and there goes the last of the doctor's boat. Come out of the dark, Midwinter. I can't half see you there, and I want to know what's to be done next." Midwinter neither answered nor moved. Allan left the bulwark, and, mounting the forecastle, looked down attentively at the waters of the Sound. "One thing is pretty certain," he said. "With the current on that side, and the sunken rocks on this, we can't find our way out of the scrape by swimming, at any rate. So much for the prospect at this end of the wreck. Let's see how things look at the other. Rouse up, messmate!" he called out cheerfully as he passed Midwinter. "Come and see what the old tub of a timber ship has got to show us astern." He sauntered on, with his hands in his pockets, humming the chorus of a comic song. His voice had produced no apparent effect on his friend, but at the light touch of his hand in passing, Midwinter started and moved out slowly from the shadow of the bulwark. "Come along!" cried Allan, suspending his singing for a moment and glancing back. Still without a word of answer, the other followed. Thrice he stopped before he reached the stern end of the wreck. The first time, to throw aside his hat and push back his hair from his forehead and temples. The second time, reeling giddy, to hold for a moment by a ring-bolt close at hand. The last time, though Allan was plainly visible a few yards ahead, to look stealthily behind him with the furtive scrutiny of a man who believes that other footsteps are following him in the dark. "Not yet," he whispered to himself, with eyes that searched the empty air. "I shall see him astern, with his hand on the lock of the cabin door." The stern end of the wreck was clear of the shipbreaker's lumber, accumulated in other parts of the vessel. Here the one object that rose visible on the smooth surface of the deck was the low wooden structure which held the cabin door and roofed in the cabin stairs. The wheelhouse had been removed, the binnacle had been removed, but the cabin entrance and all that belonged to it had been left untouched. The scuttle was on, and the door was closed. On gaining the after part of the vessel, Allan walked straight to the stern, and looked out to sea over the taffrail. No such thing as a boat was in view anywhere on the quiet, moon-brightened waters. Knowing Midwinter's sight to be better than his own, he called out, "Come up here, and see if there's a fisherman within hail of us." Hearing no reply, he looked back. Midwinter had followed him as far as the cabin and had stopped there. He called again in a louder voice, and beckoned impatiently. Midwinter had heard the call, for he looked up, but still he never stirred from his place. There he stood, as if he had reached the utmost limits of the ship, and could go no further. Allan went back and joined him. It was not easy to discover what he was looking at, for he kept his face turned away from the moonlight, but it seemed as if his eyes were fixed, with a strange expression of inquiry, on the cabin door. "What is there to look at there?" Allan asked. "Let's see if it's locked." As he took a step forward to open the door, Midwinter's hand seized him suddenly by the coat collar and forced him back. The moment after, the hand relaxed without losing its grasp, and trembled violently, like the hand of a man completely unnerved. "Am I to consider myself in custody?" asked Allan, half astonished and half amused. "Why, in the name of wonder, do you keep staring at the cabin door? Any suspicious noises below? It's no use disturbing the rats, if that's what you mean. We haven't got a dog with us. Men? Living men they can't be, for they would have heard us and come on deck. Dead men? Quite impossible. No ship's crew could be drowned in a land-locked place like this, unless the vessel broke up under them. And here's the vessel as steady as a church to speak for herself. Man alive, how your hand trembles! What is there to scare you in that rotten old cabin? What are you shaking and shivering about? Any company of the supernatural sort on board? Mercy preserve us! As the old women say, do you see a ghost?" "I see two," answered the other, driven headlong into speech and action by a maddening temptation to reveal the truth. "Two," he repeated, his breath bursting from him in deep, heavy gasps, as he tried vainly to force back the horrible words. "The ghost of a man like you drowning in the cabin, and the ghost of a man like me turning the lock of the door on him." Once more young Armadale's hearty laughter rang out loud and long through the stillness of the night. "Turning the lock of the door, is he?" said Allan, as soon as his merriment left him breath enough to speak. "That's a devilish unhandsome action, Master Midwinter, on the part of your ghost. The least I can do after that is to let mine out of the cabin, and give him the run of the ship." With no more than a momentary exertion of his superior strength, he freed himself easily from Midwinter's hold. "Below there!" he called out gayly, as he laid his strong hand on the crazy lock and tore open the cabin door. "Ghost of Allan Armadale, come on deck!" In his terrible ignorance of the truth, he put his head into the doorway and looked down, laughing, at the place where his murdered father had died. "Pah!" he exclaimed, and stepping back suddenly with a shudder of disgust. "The air is foul already, and the cabin is full of water." It was true. The sunken rocks on which the vessel lay wrecked had burst their way through her lower timbers astern, and the water had welled up through the rifted wood. Here, where the deed had been done, the fatal parallel between the past and the present was complete. What the cabin had been in the time of the fathers, that cabin was now in the time of the sons. Allan pushed the door to again with his foot, a little surprised at the sudden silence which appeared to have fallen on his friend from the moment when he had laid his hand on the cabin lock. When he turned to look, the reason of the silence was instantly revealed. Midwinter had dropped on the deck. He lay senseless before the cabin door, his face turned up, white and still to the moonlight, like the face of a dead man. In a moment Allan was at his side. He looked uselessly round the lonely limits of the wreck as he lifted Midwinter's head on his knee, for a chance of help, where all chance was ruthlessly cut off. "What am I to do?" he said to himself, in the first impulse of alarm. Not a drop of water near but the foul water in the cabin. A sudden recollection crossed his memory. The florid color rushed back over his face, and he drew from his pocket a wicker-covered flask. "God bless the doctor for giving me this before we sailed!" he broke out, fervently, as he poured down Midwinter's throat some drops of the raw whiskey which the flask contained. The stimulant acted instantly on the sensitive system of the swooning man. He sighed faintly and slowly opened his eyes. "Have I been dreaming?" he asked, looking up vacantly in Allan's face. His eyes wandered higher, and encountered the dismantled mass of the wreck rising weird and black against the night sky. He shuddered at the sight of them, and hid his face on Allan's knee. "No dream," he murmured to himself, mournfully. "Oh me, no dream!" "You have been overtired all day," said Allan, "and this infernal adventure of ours has upset you. Take some more whiskey; it's sure to do you good. Can you sit by yourself, if I put you against the bulwark so?" "Why by myself? Why do you leave me?" asked Midwinter. Allan pointed to the mizzen shrouds of the wreck, which were still left standing. "You are not well enough to rough it here till the workmen come off in the morning," he said. "We must find our way on shore at once, if we can. I am going up to get a good view all round, and see if there's a house within hail of us." Even in the moment that passed while those few words were spoken, Midwinter's eyes wandered back distrustfully to the fatal cabin door. "Don't go near it," he whispered. "Don't try to open it, for God's sake!" "No, no," returned Allan, humoring him. "When I come down from the rigging, I'll come back here." He said the words a little constrainedly, noticing for the first time while he now spoke an underlying distress in Midwinter's face, which grieved and perplexed him. "You're not angry with me," he said, in his simple, sweet-tempered way. "All this is my fault, I know, and I was a brute and a fool to laugh at you when I ought to have seen you were ill. I am so sorry, Midwinter. Don't be angry with me." Midwinter slowly raised his head. His eyes rested with a mournful interest, long and tender, on Allan's anxious face. "Angry?" he repeated, in his lowest, gentlest tones. "Angry with you? Oh, my poor boy, were you to blame for being kind to me when I was ill in the old West Country inn? And was I to blame for feeling your kindness thankfully? Was it our fault that we never doubted each other, and never knew that we were traveling together blindfold on the way that was to lead us here? The cruel time is coming, Allan, when we shall rue the day we ever met. Shake hands, brother, on the edge of the precipice. Shake hands while we are brothers still." Allan turned away quickly, convinced that his mind had not yet recovered from the shock of the fainting fit. "Don't forget the whiskey," he said, cheerfully, as he sprang into the rigging and mounted to the mizzen top. It was past 2. The moon was waning, and the darkness that comes before dawn was beginning to gather round the wreck. Behind Allan, as he now stood looking out from the elevation of the mizzen top, spread the broad and lonely sea. Before him were the low, black, lurking rocks, and the broken waters of the channel, pouring white and angry into the vast calm of the westward ocean beyond. On the right hand, heaved back grandly from the waterside, were the rocks and precipices, with their little tablelands of grass between, the sloping downs and upward-rolling heath solitudes of the Isle of Man. On the left hand rose the craggy sides of the islet of the Calf, here rent wildly into deep black chasms, there lying low under long sweeping acclivities of grass and heath. No sound rose, no light was visible on either shore. The black lines of the topmost masts of the wreck looked shadowy and faint in the darkening mystery of the sky. The land breeze had dropped. The small shoreward waves fell noiseless, far or near. No sound was audible but the cheerless bubbling of the broken water ahead, pouring through the awful hush of silence in which earth and ocean waited for the coming day. Even Allan's careless nature felt the solemn influence of the time. The sound of his own voice startled him when he looked down and hailed his friend on deck. "I think I see one house," he said. Here away on the mainland to the right. He looked again, to make sure, at a dim little patch of white, with faint white lines behind it, nestling low in a grassy hollow on the main island. "It looks like a stone house and enclosure," he resumed. "I'll hail it on the chance." He passed his arm round a rope to steady himself, made a speaking trumpet of his hands, and suddenly dropped them again without uttering a sound. "It's so awfully quiet," he whispered to himself. "I'm half afraid to call out." He looked down again on deck. "I shan't startle you, Midwinter, shall I?" he said, with an uneasy laugh. He looked once more at the faint white object in the grassy hollow. "It won't do to have come up here for nothing," he thought, and made a speaking trumpet of his hands again. This time he gave the hail with the whole power of his lungs. "On shore there!" he shouted, turning his face to the main island. "Ahoy, hoy, hoy!" The last echoes of his voice died away and were lost. No sound answered him but the cheerless bubbling of the broken water ahead. He looked down again at his friend, and saw the dark figure of Midwinter rise erect and pace the deck backward and forward, never disappearing out of sight of the cabin when it retired toward the bows of the wreck, and never passing beyond the cabin when it returned toward the stern. "He is impatient to get away," thought Allan. "I'll try again." He hailed the land once more, and, taught by previous experience, pitched his voice in its highest key. This time another sound than the sound of the bubbling water answered him. The lowing of frightened cattle rose from the building in the grassy hollow, and traveled far and drearily through the stillness of the morning air. Allan waited and listened. If the building was a farmhouse, the disturbance among the beasts would rouse them in. If it was only a cattle stable, nothing more would happen. The lowing of the frightened brutes rose and fell drearily. The minutes passed, and nothing happened. "Once more," said Allan, looking down at the restless figure pacing beneath him. For the third time he hailed the land. For the third time he waited and listened. In a pause of silence among the cattle, he heard behind him, on the opposite shore of the channel, faint and far among the solitudes of the islet of the Calf, a sharp, sudden sound, like the distant clash of a heavy door-bolt drawn back. Turning at once in the new direction, he strained his eyes to look for a house. The last faint rays of the waning moonlight trembled here and there on the higher rocks, and on the steeper pinnacles of ground, but great strips of darkness lay dense and black over all the land between, and in that darkness the house, if house there were, was lost to view. "I have roused somebody at last," Allan called out encouragingly to Midwinter, still walking to and fro on the deck, strangely indifferent to all that was passing above and beyond him. "Look out for the answering hail!" And with his face set towards the islet, Allan shouted for help. The shout was not answered, but mimicked with a shrill, shrieking derision, with wilder and wilder cries rising out of the deep, distant darkness, and mingling horribly the expression of a human voice with the sound of a brute's. A sudden suspicion crossed Allan's mind, which made his head swim and turned his hand cold as it held the rigging. In breathless silence he looked toward the quarter from which the first mimicry of his cry for help had come. After a moment's pause, the shrieks were renewed, and the sound of them came nearer. Suddenly a figure, which seemed the figure of a man, leaped up black on a pinnacle of rock, and capered and shrieked in the waning gleam of the moonlight. The screams of a terrified woman mingled with the cries of the capering creature on the rock. A red spark flashed out in the darkness from a light kindled in an invisible window. The hoarse shouting of a man's voice in anger was heard through the noise. A second black figure leaped up on the rock, struggled with the first figure, and disappeared with it in the darkness. The cries grew fainter and fainter, the screams of the woman were stilled, the hoarse voice of the man was heard again for a moment, hailing the wreck in words made unintelligible by the distance, but in tones plainly expressive of rage and fear combined. Another moment, and the clang of the door-bolt was heard again, the red spark of light was quenched in darkness, and all the islet lay quiet in the shadows once more. The lowing of the cattle on the mainland ceased, rose again, stopped. Then, cold and cheerless as ever, the eternal bubbling of the broken water welled up through the great gap of silence, the one sound left, as the mysterious stillness of the hour felt like a mantle from the heavens, and closed over the wreck. Allan descended from his place in the mizzen top, and joined his friend again on deck. "We must wait till the shipbreakers come off to their work," he said, meeting Midwinter halfway in the course of his restless walk. "After what has happened, I don't mind confessing that I've had enough of hailing the land. Only think of there being a madman in that house ashore, and of my waking him! Horrible, wasn't it?" Midwinter stood still for a moment, and looked at Allan, with the perplexed air of a man who hears circumstances familiarly mentioned to which he is himself a total stranger. He appeared, if such a thing had been possible, to have passed over entirely without notice all that had just happened on the islet of the Calf. "Nothing is horrible out of this ship," he said. "Everything is horrible in it." Answering in those strange words, he turned away again, and went on with his walk. Allan picked up the flask of whisky lying on the deck near him, and revived his spirits with a dram. "Here's one thing on board that isn't horrible," he retorted briskly, as he screwed on the stopper of the flask. "And here's another," he added, as he took a cigar from his case and lit it. "3 o'clock," he went on, looking at his watch, and settling himself comfortably on deck with his back against the bulwark. "Daybreak isn't far off. We shall have the piping of the birds to cheer us up before long. I say, Midwinter, you seem to have quite got over that unlucky fainting fit. How do you keep walking? Come here and have a cigar, and make yourself comfortable. What's the good of tramping backward and forward in that restless way?" "I am waiting," said Midwinter. "Waiting? For what?" "For what is to happen to you or to me, or to both of us, before we are out of this ship." "With submission to your superior judgment, my dear fellow, I think quite enough has happened already. The adventure will do very well as it stands now. More of it is more than I want." He took another dram of whisky, and rambled on, between the puffs of his cigar, in his usual easy way. "I've not got your fine imagination, old boy, and I hope the next thing that happens will be the appearance of the workmen's boat. I suspect that queer fancy of yours has been running away with you while you were down here all by yourself. Come now, what were you thinking of while I was up in the mizzen top frightening the cows?" Midwinter suddenly stopped. "Suppose I tell you," he said. "Suppose you do." The torturing temptation to reveal the truth, roused once already by his companion's merciless gaiety of spirit, possessed itself of Midwinter for the second time. He leaned back in the darkness against the high side of the ship, and looked down in silence at Allan's figure, stretched comfortably on the deck. "Rouse him," the fiend whispered subtly, "from that ignorant self-possession and that pitiless repose. Show him the place where the deed was done. Let him know it with your knowledge, and fear it with your dread. Tell him of the letter you burned, and of the words no fire can destroy which are living in your memory now. Let him see your mind as it was yesterday, when it roused your sinking faith in your own convictions, to look back on your life at sea, and to cherish the comforting remembrances that, in all your voyages, you had never fallen in with this ship. Let him see your mind as it is now, when the ship has got you at the turning point of your new life, at the outset of your friendship with the one man of all men whom your father warned you to avoid. Think of those deathbed words, and whisper them in his ear, and he may think of them too. Hide yourself from him under an assumed name. Put the mountains and the seas between you. Be ungrateful, be unforgiving, be all that is most repellent to your own gentler nature, rather than live under the same roof and breathe the same air with that man." So the tempter counseled. So, like a noisome exhalation from the father's grave, the father's influence rose and poisoned the mind of the son. The sudden silence surprised Allan. He looked back drowsily over his shoulder. "Thinking again?" he exclaimed, with a weary yawn. Midwinter stepped out from the shadow, and came nearer to Allan than he had come yet. "Yes," he said, thinking of the past and the future. "The past and the future?" repeated Allan, shifting himself comfortably into a new position. "For my part, I'm dumb about the past. It's a sore subject with me. The past means the loss of the doctor's boat. Let's talk about the future. Have you been taking a practical view, as dear old Brock calls it? Have you been considering the next serious question that concerns us both when we get back to the hotel? The question of breakfast?" End of Chapter 4, Part 1. Recording by Alan Winterroud. Boomcoach.blogspot.com